Welcome back to another episode. And tonight I'm going to continue discussing postmodern art, but this time I'll be discussing what I have been thinking is the core idea behind modern and postmodern art, a core concept that can help to unify some ideas about how to look at modern and postmodern art, which is the concept of death as a closure of potentiality for being. And last time I was saying that one of the characteristic motifs in postmodern art is the motif of the nostalgia film. That's something that Frederick Jameson discusses. And the other one is pastiche, which Jameson seems to carry forward to the point that it's almost sort of the core idea behind postmodern art. And again, pastiche is kind of a way of reappropriating older styles of art, sometimes mixing many of them together in a single artwork and doing something new with them, something to reappropriate them to one's own sense of self-expression. So that could be something like taking a piece of music and then taking bits of other pieces of music that have been used elsewhere and doing something new with them. And that's something that has been done very frequently in the last 10, 15 years or so. And it's one that Jameson was already discussing in the 1980s. So the interesting thing about both nostalgia films and the phenomenon of pastiche, its growing popularity, is that both of them involve ways of living in the past to a certain extent. Like we get a certain feeling of pleasure from the memory of an older time. Something's familiar that we can be drawn back to. It can take us through that sense of familiarity to a kind of feeling of pleasure. And in the case of the nostalgia film, we're able to really kind of sit in that state of taking pleasure in an older past time. One of the best examples of that could be the film American Graffiti, which was one that I mentioned briefly last time. The film American Graffiti is about a small town in California where some kids are growing up in the 1950s and they have these drag races with their cars out on a highway. They do lots of very stereotypical 1950s kinds of things. If I remember correctly, there are quite a few scenes where they meet in a diner. I think they're all in high school and they have social cliques and whatnot that are very typical of the sort of way that you'd remember the 1950s. And nostalgia films became quite popular in the early 80s, but they flow also into styles of music even more prominently, and they make their way into novels sometimes in the way that intertextuality can be used as a technique of both writing a novel and interpreting a novel. So in a book like James Joyce's Ulysses, you have many references to many books or other cultural productions outside that book itself that help to expand the scheme, help expand the parameters, I guess you could say, of what the book is trying to encompass. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, a poem, is a very good representative of that kind of strategy. And it's one that comes up in modernist literature. It's one that also makes its way into the postmodern scene as well. So what I want to say about all of this is that death is a core idea in the sense that all of these ways of reappropriating the past are ways of coming to grips with the potentiality for being that belongs to something and its closure. And if we go back again to the example of Marilyn Monroe, there's a certain way in which we can look at those four images of Marilyn, and we can see it on the one hand as the representation of this vibrant woman, a celebrity with a certain aura of celebrity about her, and at the same time perhaps even appreciate what she meant to us culturally or individually, because of the fact that that time period has passed, and its closure brings even greater poignancy to the meaning, to the significance that those images can have for us. Because what we are looking at, both in the artwork itself hanging on the wall, which was produced by Andy Warhol in a particular place, a particular time, as part of the pop art movement, is something that will never be retrieved, both in the terms of the artwork itself, when it was created and where, and the subject matter. We are thrown into nostalgia. And the reason why it's effective is because of that closure of potentiality for being. And I'm using the phrase potentiality for being because I have in mind to discuss a little bit from Heidegger, from Heidegger's Being of Time, just to use some of the tools that are there in Being in Time to discuss death, to discuss how it can affect us and how it can affect our approach to life, and to use those tools to then begin to discuss how death and life and love and desire and those sorts of things can enter into our experience of a work of art to give it added poignancy. So before going into Heidegger, what I want to do is just kind of reflect a little bit about the relationship between love / desire and death. And I want to just think about death in a broader sense here as just involving, the closure of a certain kind of possibility, which is really what death is, the way that we encounter it in life, if we allow for a broadening of the definition. So there could be death of a time period, the death of a moment, the death of a love story, etc. In that sense of being a closure of potentiality, a closure of potentiality for being. So in the nostalgia film, if we allow for that broadened sense of death, meaning the closure of that time period, the fact that it has that closure to it brings us forward in a sense. It brings something forward in us, which is the desire for it not to end. In a sense, a desire for life, a desire that potentiality won't come to an end. And perhaps there is a deep psychological way in which when we encounter death or some sort of manifestation of death, perhaps in our own lives as a time that we can never regain, and as death being part of, the thing that constitutes the temporality of our life in a constitutive sense. When that time period is no longer available to us, when it's gone forever, we perhaps in our desire to live want to come forward with our desire for life, which is kind of the opposite pull against death, that makes that moment more poignant. So wherever you have death, whenever we're confronted with death, it has a way of bringing up against it a kind of desire for life, a kind of desire for continuation. And so when we're confronted with Marylin, when we're confronted with the end of a time period, when we're confronted with the fact of the end of her life, that does something to us where it causes us to think about death. And perhaps there's something in us that comes forward that looks for a way to continue, looks for something that wants to live in the face of the closure of that possibility, of the closure of that potentiality for being. And it's in the sacred aspects of art, perhaps most of all, where we've been allowed traditionally to find a way to transcend that moment of limitation in life. Something that recalls to us the fact of death, something that recalls to us the temporality that constitutes our life. And the interesting thing about the Marylin images is that because she is a celebrity, as I tried to argue last time, her very celebrity itself gives her a kind of aura, which is not a sacred aura. Being a celebrity doesn't make you a kind of sacred figure. And as I mentioned, Benjamin argues that the mass production of art tends to diminish any kind of auratic quality that an artwork can have. But the fact that she died, the fact that she belongs to a time period that can never be recovered, does something to bring that aura back to her. It does something to bring that aura of sacredness to her life and what she represents, where the artwork itself becomes a way of making permanent and making ever living what she represented. And so perhaps you could think of the sacred as a way of redeeming humans and their potentiality for being in the face of death. So with that, what I want to do is pivot to Heidegger and his discussion of some of these ideas in Being and Time. Now, Heidegger discusses death in somewhat similar terms. He discusses death as something that is always already part of the way that we have to conceive of life, because from the very moment that we're born, death already constitutes the terms of our existence. But what death does is something also that also gives it also does something positive for us, which is that because death is something that we have to encounter individually, belongs to us alone and to no one else, it's something that has the potential to lead us back to ourselves. And one of the things that Heidegger thinks we should try to avoid is being lost in what he calls the they self. The they self, I think you could think of in terms of Baudrillard and his idea of simulations. And now that we have the concept of the they self on the table, I think the two concepts work very well together. We live in a society that is very media saturated. And as I was saying a couple episodes back, if you think about a couple of peasants living in the 13th century or, any medieval century you want to name, it's far easier for those peasants, because they don't live in a media saturated world, to live authentically. So if you try to live as a peasant in the 21st century, what can lead you astray from that is living in the they. The they in this case being media representations, ideas about what it is to be a peasant, the sort of clothes that a peasant might wear. And you could just think, well, if we're gonna go out and try to be a couple of peasants today, what is it that's going to allow us to authentically be peasants? Is it the clothes we wear? Is it the kind of work we do? Is it where we live? The conditions under which we live? All of those things are mediated by the kinds of images and ideas, the films, the advertisements, the representations that we have been so saturated with when it comes to just being peasants. And it seems to me that in a case like in the medieval world, where you don't live in a media saturated world, it's far easier to simply be a peasant than it is now. But in any case, Heidegger's idea is that there are these two poles within the personality. There is the they self, which is something you can get lost in, which can pull you away from your authentic self. And what calls you back to your authentic self is what he calls the conscience. He, in fact, calls the call of conscience the call back to oneself. And we don't need to think of conscience in anything like the Kantian sense, where it has this, where it's carrying this heavy moral and ethical baggage. It's simply a call back to one's authentic being from being lost in otherness. And it seems to me that this is something that art might be able to accomplish. I think modern art in particular has the tools to do this very well. When you're presented with abstract art, something like a Kandinsky painting, or maybe a Picasso, or maybe even in some cases impressionistic art from maybe what you'd call an early modern or pre-modern period, has the tools to do this. How exactly does it have the tools to do this? Well, because it confronts you with a kind of otherness that calls you back to yourself. When you look at that abstract work of art by Jackson Pollock, if you allow yourself to be pulled in by it, I think it's not too difficult to try to feel something like a genuine feeling of some kind of relation to the painting that takes you to an authentic place inside of yourself. Perhaps this is also possible with different ways in which death is manifested in nostalgia films and in pastiche art, where when that moment becomes poignant, when we experience it as something that leads us back to ourselves and doesn't pull us into the they self, when the reverie itself doesn't completely take over and it leads us back to ourselves, then art has the capacity for doing that. And it seems to me that, with the concepts of the sublime and the concept of auratic art defined in the way they are, the fact of death should be able to do that. And in some cases, certainly more successfully than others. Because I think the difficulty with postmodern art over modern art is that it does, because it tries to reflect, in a lot of cases, our media saturatedness, it does have more of a potential for leading you away from yourself to an experience of just more media saturatedness. So when you look at the 4 images of Marilyn Monroe, if you look at it purely as pop art, purely as a piece of entertainment, then there is the potential that it becomes a piece of art that leads you away from your authentic self into reverie with what Heidegger calls the they self. So in that case, it would be doing the opposite of what great art perhaps has the potential to do in helping people have a higher feeling of revelation, perhaps some experience that leads to a liberation. And certainly in the case of sacred art, its highest potential is to help us to face death, which is a theme in Heidegger where he discusses death. He calls it a freedom towards death, but in the case of sacred art, it's a freedom towards death that, in a sense, allows you to transcend the problem of death, to get beyond the problem of death. When it comes to the images of Marilyn, and maybe in those more successful moments of nostalgia where it doesn't simply lead you into engagement with otherness and the they self, the realization that the frozenness of the time also through the artwork itself, where it immortalizes it, allows for a continuation of that life even as it once again brings up its closure. So through death and its, let's say, transcendence through the life that art gives it, perhaps in that dynamic we have the foundation for a way of looking at art and a way of thinking of art that allows even postmodern art to transcend itself, to be more than itself. And it certainly involves a way of seeing, involves a way of looking, involves a way of experiencing artwork. But the contrast between death and life is something that allows us to feel a certain degree of poignancy in the moment as we feel the loss of the moment, but also that part of ourselves that wants to live, that wants to find a way to transcend that death of the death of that moment. We can see the work of art itself as providing a way for life to continue and the continuation of that moment as having a kind of sacred character. So this is an interesting way to think about the secularizing of the sacred in a work of art. And it's something that postmodern art and modern art, which are both products of the 20th century, have had to figure out. and postmodern art even more so than modern art, because if Lyotard is right, and it certainly seems like he is, postmodern art cannot rely upon meta narratives to make its case. And what you must do instead to try to find the sacred, to try to find a way for art to transcend itself, is to find meaning in a connection that is localized between the artist and the person experiencing the work of art. And so the conditions under which that transcendence can take place are delimited in that, within that framework. But at the same time, because these themes like life and death, sorrow and joy, and our seemingly innate feeling for the sacred, and also trying to find an authentic place within ourselves as a way to experience art, is something that we seem still, even in this age of skepticism about meta narratives, to be very much looking for, and very much to, and still very much defines our sense of what great art can do for us and its potential. So, with that, I will say good night.